Beneath the island of Okinawa lies one of the most horrifying secrets of World War II. When American soldiers finally entered the hidden tunnels, what they uncovered defied imagination. Underground hospitals where the wounded begged for death, civilians who never escaped the darkness, and chambers where entire families chose suicide over surrender. These were not just caves, they were tombs carved into the earth. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the discoveries made here still haunt history. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more World War II stories that reveal the darkest truths buried by time. When Japanese commanders understood that Okinawa would be the last barrier before the homeland, they turned to the earth itself for salvation. The limestone of the island was soft enough to carve, but strong enough to endure bombardment, and so the order was given: transform Okinawa into a fortress below ground. Soldiers, students, and even entire families were forced to dig. Day after day, the sound of chisels and picks rang through the hills, echoing like a heartbeat inside the rock. Men carried out baskets of rubble while women and children hauled water to keep down the clouds of dust. Some workers collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies dragged aside as others took their place. These tunnels weren't crude shelters. They were designed to be a hidden city of war. Engineers mapped entire labyrinths, ammunition chambers built behind blast walls, command posts wired with phones, infirmaries sunk into hollows, and narrow crawl spaces meant to funnel attackers into traps. At Shuri Castle, the Japanese constructed their crown jewel, a headquarters buried beneath the fortress, capable of holding thousands. From here, officers planned to bleed the Americans dry, no matter the cost. But these tunnels were more than military architecture. They were pits of dread. Air grew foul, lanterns burned dim, and silence pressed on the lungs of anyone inside. Every turn felt like a descent into the underworld. Civilians brought in for safety soon realized they were prisoners. Soldiers cursed the suffocating heat, but endured, convinced the walls would protect them when the bombs began to fall. What none of them realized was that they were carving not just bunkers, but their own graves. By the time American troops landed in April 1945, Okinawa had become a honeycomb of shadows, each tunnel hiding secrets that would shock the world when daylight finally reached them. The invasion of Okinawa began with a storm of fire. American battleships shelled the beaches, aircraft dropped bombs in waves, and the island's surface erupted in smoke and flame. But when the Marines advanced inland, they found something uncanny. The defenders weren't where they were supposed to be. Villages looked deserted. Trenches were empty. For a brief moment, some thought the enemy had retreated deeper into the island. Then the earth itself answered back. Mortars burst from hillsides that seconds earlier seemed lifeless. Machine gun fire spat from holes in the rock. Entire squads were cut down by enemies that vanished before anyone could return fire. It was then the Americans understood. They weren't fighting on Okinawa's surface. They were fighting an enemy that had disappeared beneath it. The tunnels had come alive. Soldiers began calling them rat holes, but the term hardly captured the scale. Defenders would emerge from hidden doors, strike with precision, and then slip back underground. A hilltop cleared in the morning might erupt with fire again by dusk. Flamethrowers and grenades became essential tools, but sealing one entrance only forced troops to face another hidden mouth further down the slope. Inside the tunnels, the combat was unlike anything in military training. Darkness swallowed light, gunfire rang like thunderclaps in confined passages, and smoke turned oxygen into poison. Marines described it as fighting in coffins. Every corridor, a potential ambush, every shadow concealing death. The deeper they pushed, the more their nerves frayed. They had expected soldiers in foxholes. Instead, they faced an entire invisible army lurking underfoot. For Americans, every step forward meant descending into a nightmare. And for the Japanese, the tunnels became both shield and trap, fortresses that would eventually betray those who believed they offered salvation. For Okinawan civilians, the tunnels were never sanctuaries. They were cages of despair. Entire villages were herded underground by military order, told they would be safe beneath the stone. Families carried bedding, heirlooms, and what little food they owned into caverns already choked with smoke and sweat. Once sealed inside, the reality struck. There was no air circulation, no sanitation, no escape. Mothers rocked infants to keep them silent as dust rained down from artillery outside. Children scratched words into limestone walls, crude messages begging ancestors for protection. Whispered prayers mingled with coughs that could betray their position to the enemy above. The soldiers treated civilians as expendable. Rations were seized to feed garrisons. Men were forced to dig new chambers until their hands bled. Girls as young as 14 were pressed into service as nurses or couriers, carrying messages through suffocating passageways. Fear became constant. American leaflet drops promised safety if they surrendered, but propaganda spread by the Japanese warned of torture and mutilation if captured. Parents repeated these lies until their children believed them, trembling at the very thought of daylight. Conditions grew intolerable. Water supplies dwindled to muddy trickles from cave walls. Food spoiled in the humid air. Lice and rats thrived, gnawing on the sick and dead. Families huddled together in pitch blackness, listening to gunfire reverberate above them, convinced each blast would be their last. Some began to lose their grip on reality, mistaking shadows for spirits, or hearing voices in the endless silence. The tunnels became liminal spaces, neither fully of the living nor the dead. When Americans finally entered, they found not just soldiers, but civilians crouched in filth, too weak to move, their eyes reflecting the light like those of trapped animals. What was meant as protection had become a descent into madness. Few places exposed the horror of Okinawa more than the tunnel hospitals. Carved into damp caverns, these makeshift infirmaries were hell's operating rooms. By the flicker of oil lamps, surgeons worked on stretchers soaked in blood, their instruments blunt from overuse. Morphine supplies were gone within weeks, forcing doctors to amputate without anesthesia. The screams of patients echoed so loudly that guards stuffed rags in their ears to endure the sound. Nurses, many teenage students pressed into service, collapsed from exhaustion, their uniforms stiff with dried blood. The air was foul, a mixture of pus, sweat, and smoke from cooking fires used to sterilize scalpels. Flies swarmed untreated wounds, and maggots began to infest flesh. Amputated limbs piled in corners like discarded logs, while the dying begged for mercy that could not be granted. Some soldiers clasped grenades, pleading with doctors to let them die by their own hand rather than linger. Others prayed aloud, their chants echoing until drowned by explosions overhead. The hospitals themselves shook with every bombardment, dust and rock falling into open wounds. When American troops broke into these chambers, the sight stunned even hardened veterans. They found bodies stacked beside the living, mouths frozen in silent screams. Surgeons' notebooks lay scattered, pages filled with bloodstains and desperate notes about supplies that never came. One Marine later admitted he couldn't forget the faces, eyes wide, pupils dilated, staring into darkness even after death. These were not hospitals. They were charnel houses where medicine collapsed under the weight of endless suffering. The tunnels had been designed to shield life, but what the Americans found were galleries of pain carved into stone. Survivors who crawled out carried memories they never spoke of, their silence itself a testament to how unspeakable those days had been. In these subterranean infirmaries, the line between healer and executioner blurred, leaving only the residue of horror to seep into history. When U.S. forces finally breached many of the tunnels, they expected firefights. What they stumbled upon instead left scars far deeper than combat. Patrols entered cautiously, rifles leveled, flamethrowers ready. At first, they saw only abandoned supplies, helmets, canteens, crates of ammunition stacked neatly against damp walls. But as lantern light swept forward, the shadows revealed something more grotesque. In one chamber, Marines discovered bodies piled chest-high, flesh already crawling with vermin. In another, they found the remnants of mass suicides, civilians huddled in circles, grenades still clutched in skeletal hands. Entire families had died within inches of each other, their remains locked in eternal embraces. The shock went beyond sight. It was the smell that broke men's composure. Rot seeped into their clothes and clung to their skin. Some gagged, others vomited. A few stood silent, unable to process what they were seeing. Years later, veterans admitted that the tunnels were worse than the beaches, because the enemy above could at least be fought. In the darkness below, all that remained were ghosts. One group uncovered a collapsed hospital cavern where nurses had tended to soldiers until the very end. Their uniforms were stiff with dried blood, their faces frozen in anguish. Not a single survivor remained, only scattered syringes and shattered lamps. Another patrol entered a storage shaft and found charred bones fused to the walls. Bodies burned deliberately to prevent capture. The Americans carried out what remains they could, but many tunnels were too unstable to explore fully. Whole complexes were sealed with explosives, entombing the dead forever. To the Marines, the island had already been hell above ground. What they discovered below convinced them that Okinawa's war wasn't just a battle. It was a descent into something primal and nightmarish, where humanity itself had dissolved into shadows. Perhaps the most haunting revelations came from chambers of mass suicide. Japanese officers had told soldiers and civilians alike that surrender was dishonor, that Americans would torture women and butcher children. Trapped underground with dwindling supplies, entire groups believed death was the only choice left. Parents were given grenades and instructed to use one for the enemy, one for yourself. Others carried vials of poison, prepared for the moment of no return. When American forces uncovered these sites, they found scenes that defied comprehension. In one cavern, families sat together as if for a meal, their bodies torn apart by explosions. Small skulls lay in the laps of larger ones. In another, the walls were smeared with soot, evidence of fires set intentionally before grenades ended lives. Some tunnels reeked of burned flesh weeks after the detonations. The tragedy wasn't just in the scale, it was in the silence. Civilians had waited in darkness, listening to propaganda, convinced that capture meant worse than death. Survivors later confessed how neighbors begged one another to act quickly, how mothers calmed infants with lullabies seconds before pulling pins. For the Americans who entered afterward, the silence was deafening. No gunfire, no resistance, only the echo of choices forced by fear and fanaticism. These discoveries horrified even hardened veterans. One officer admitted that of all the battles he fought, it was the memory of women and children in those tunnels that haunted him the most. The war had twisted civilians into soldiers, families into martyrs, caves into graves. And though the fighting raged on above, the Americans knew that below their boots, countless unseen tragedies had already ended in darkness. Beneath the ruins of Shuri Castle, once a royal palace and symbol of Okinawa's heritage, lay the most elaborate tunnel complex on the island. Japanese engineers had carved a command center deep into the limestone, with long galleries lined by telephone wires, map tables, and sleeping quarters for officers. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, directed the defense of Okinawa from this subterranean stronghold. For weeks, American shells and bombs rained down above, flattening the ancient fortress. Yet the officers below continued giving orders as if untouched. Their voices carried down corridors where clerks scribbled notes and runners darted through the dim light of lanterns. When American forces finally broke into the area in late May 1945, what they found was shocking. The once bustling nerve center had transformed into a tomb. Maps lay scattered across tables, some smeared with blood, others pinned to walls with bayonets. Half-burned documents smoldered in piles, evidence of desperate attempts to erase secrets before capture. Radios still crackled with static, wires dangling uselessly from the ceilings. Then came the most disturbing discovery: the suicides of the generals themselves. Ushijima and Cho had chosen ritual death rather than surrender. Their bodies were found outside the caves, cloaked in dignity, but surrounded by devastation. Marines who entered described the atmosphere as suffocating, not just from lack of oxygen, but from the weight of finality. Here, the architects of Okinawa's underground war had written their last chapter enter in silence. For the Americans, it was surreal to stand inside a labyrinth that once held Japan's high command. They realized that the tunnels had been more than defensive structures. They were symbols of fanatic resolve. Every twist of the passageways carried the echo of orders that condemned soldiers, civilians, and even children to fight to the death. Shuri Castle above was rubble, but below, the earth still pulsed with the memory of a command that chose annihilation over surrender. Even after the main battle ended, the tunnels refused to surrender. Small groups of Japanese soldiers continued to resist for weeks, hiding deep within the labyrinth, emerging only at night to harass American patrols. These were not organized defenses, but desperate, fanatical last stands. Some soldiers crawled through shafts, no wider than their shoulders, firing blindly before retreating into the black. Others laid booby traps at entrances, waiting for footsteps that never came. American units tasked with clearing these tunnels called it mopping up, but it felt nothing like routine. Every mission was a descent into claustrophobia. Soldiers described the fear of crawling into darkness, knowing an unseen enemy might be inches away, blade or bayonet ready. Flamethrowers were often used, the fire sucking oxygen from chambers and turning confined spaces into ovens. When the flames died, silence followed, until sudden bursts of gunfire proved that some had survived. The psychological strain broke men on both sides. Japanese defenders, starving and delirious, sometimes emerged in suicidal charges, screaming as they threw themselves into gunfire. Others waited in silence, preferring to die in darkness rather than face the humiliation of capture. Americans who encountered them often felt more haunted than victorious. One Marine recalled seeing a soldier who had starved to a skeleton, still clutching a rifle, his eyes glowing in the lamplight like those of an animal cornered. Weeks turned into months, and even after Okinawa was declared secure, skirmishes echoed underground. Farmers and villagers stumbled across hidden entrances long after the battle, sometimes ambushed by soldiers who refused to accept the war was over. For locals, the tunnels became haunted places, avoided for fear of both spirits and survivors lurking within. In these final gasps of resistance, the tunnels became symbols of futility. They had promised protection, but delivered only death. For the Americans who descended, for the Japanese who remained, and for the civilians who suffered in between, the war beneath Okinawa never truly ended. It lingered in shadows, where the last defenders fought battles no one else would see. When the guns finally fell silent and Okinawa was declared secure, the island's surface bore scars of bombardment, but the greater scars lay beneath. The tunnels remained, yawning mouths in the hillsides, many sealed with explosives, others left to collapse into the earth. Yet for those who had descended into them, the memories never closed. Veterans spoke of the tunnels as places where the war had ceased to feel human. It wasn't the sight of tanks or aircraft that haunted them, but the smell of decay in stone chambers, the cries of civilians who believed surrender worse than death, and the suffocating sense that the earth itself had turned against them. For Okinawans, the tunnels became places of mourning and silence. Families who had lost loved ones returned in the years after the war, searching entrances for traces of fathers, mothers, or children who never emerged. Some carried incense and flowers, leaving offerings at cave mouths as if tending graves. Others refused to enter, too terrified of the ghosts said to wander in the dark. Even today, locals whisper of strange sounds, echoes of weeping, the faint thud of boots, or the cries of children, seeping from blocked entrances. Whether superstition or memory, the effect is the same. The tunnels are reminders of a trauma too vast to bury. In the decades since, recovery teams have worked slowly, uncovering skeletal remains and personal effects. Buttons, helmets, prayer beads, and student notebooks have been retrieved from the soil. Each item tells a story of someone who vanished underground, whose final moments were spent in fear and suffering. Archaeologists have described the bones as silent witnesses, locked in testimony against the madness of war. Over 1,000 sets of remains have been carefully catalogued, but countless more are believed to lie unrecovered, sealed forever in collapsed shafts. The legacy of the Okinawa tunnels is not one of glory, but of horror. They embody the cost of fanatic orders, the cruelty of propaganda, and the desperation of people caught between empires. To stand before a moss-covered entrance today is to feel a chill, a reminder that beneath your feet lies a world carved by human hands, but consumed by death. What the soldiers found inside was not merely shocking. It was a revelation of how far war can strip away humanity. And that is why the tunnels remain symbols of warning. They teach that when fear and fanaticism drive people underground, what emerges is not survival, but silence. Beneath Okinawa, in those pitch-black corridors, lies a truth that still terrifies. In war, the earth itself can become a tomb, and some nightmares never end.